Clear my goddamn throat. All right, we are live. So, Mike, I recently came across this article while I was at work the other day, and I I read through it, and I thought it was very interesting because just about all of it was true, and I agree with it almost 100%. So, um, yeah, there was a lot of not revelations because everything that the article discusses um, is something I was already aware of, but I thought I'd do like a discussion style video talking about it because I think it's something that is relevant and needs to be discussed. 15 Ways Final Fantasy Ruined the JRPG genre. This was published back in 2017 by Ritwik Mitra. So let's take a look here. Article starts out saying there's no doubt that the Final Fantasy series is one of the most popular, if not the most popular, JRPG series of all time. Uh, with a total sales of 130 million units worldwide, making it one of the most successful long-running video game series ever. Stories of Cecil, Terra, Cloud, Squall, Titus, and others have become fond memories in the minds of players who have been with the franchise since its heyday. However, it's no secret that the age of turn-based RPGs has been over for a long time, and now people actually, can actually look at the relationship with Final Fantasy that Final Fantasy shares with the JRPG genre, and analyze the overall effect that the franchise has had on the development of the aforementioned genre. There is no doubt that Final Fantasy has contributed to the growth of JRPGs outside Japan in a monumental way, but it can also be argued that this long-running franchise has also sowed the seeds for the genre's demise as well. Ever since the popular and well-received release of Final Fantasy VII, the franchise has been slowly spiraling downwards when it came to its popularity and took its parent genre down with it as well. There are a ton of reasons why this happened, and in this list we'll look at 15 major reasons as to how Final Fantasy has absolutely ruined the JRPG genre. And there's one thing he forgot to mention, and itself. So when it comes to Final Fantasy, I've played almost not almost. I've played every mainline game with the exception of the MMO titles, which is Final Fantasy 11 and Final Fantasy 14. I have beaten Final Fantasy 4, 6, 7, 10, 13, 1, 2, and 3, Type 0, and 15. Those are the ones that I've completed.
Okay, so you got more on me.
Yeah, so
I got I've only 10, 13. I played Lightning Returns as well. I played the Final Fantasy MMO. Shoot, what else? I think that may be it for me.
Okay.
Regarding Final Fantasy.
Yeah. So oh, and I guess I can count the Final Fantasy VII remake into that as well, which I actually platinumed. So.
Yeah.
But
I played 11 as well. My bad.
Oh, okay. So, yeah, we're both familiar. Obviously, me more so than you, but regardless, let's take a look at the list. The new games are mediocre as fuck.
That isn't a lot.
No, it's not. It is. It is absolutely. It's absolutely true. it is absolutely true. One of the major reasons that fans have cited for the decrease in the popularity of the Final Fantasy franchise is the general dip in quality that's painfully noticeable in the latest titles in the series. Comparatively, the early games were constantly redefining how stories could be told in video games. The latest titles in the franchise, like the original release of Final Fantasy XIV and Final Fantasy XIII, to name a few, showcase none of these impressive qualities. Instead, these titles have either tried to innovate on a tired gameplay system and failed miserably in the process, or they've simply attempted to emulate the elements of other more successful games to varying degrees of effectiveness. So, everything he said is absolutely factual. The problem with like the recent Final Fantasy games is that they basically, like the creators, well, the current creators over there at Square Enix, they spend their time trying to emulate other games, and they really fail to do so successfully. And that's part of why Final Fantasy has lost its identity, is that they try and emulate it and make it look like everything else. Um, and whatever they're trying to copy, that thing does whatever they're trying to do better than what they're actually trying to do. So,
Uh,
the most recent example is Final Fantasy 16, which looks to be almost like a Devil May Cry ripoff. And it's like, oh, it looks like Devil May Cry, that's exciting. It's like, that's bullshit. Why not just play Devil May Cry, which is clearly going to be better?
right.
So, and then we have Final Fantasy 13 here, which tried to basically modernize the classic ATB turn-based battle system. So you had the characters that would move around and shit, and then there would be a bar that would fill up, and then you could input the commands that the characters would take action. But it really failed that combat system really failed for a number of different reasons, and primarily the thing that people criticize that combat system for is the auto battle feature, in which the game would literally play itself, and you can just auto set the commands, and the game would automatically choose
Yeah, I remember that.
the best option to go with, and yeah, that's been a really big issue. Even with the Gambit system with Final Fantasy 12, you could set it to where the game would basically play itself, and you really didn't have to do much of anything. And yeah, that's not engaging. It's not fun. And on top of that, it's like, you know, you guys really aren't innovating in any major way over what the older games have done. And as far as the storytelling goes, I mean, the Final Fantasy games, they're really not that great story wise. They use the same tired tropes over and over again, and the characters really aren't that interesting. They carry the whole experience all the way through. And so yeah, just it really pulls out the cons more when everything is just so below the bar.
Yeah, I remember you telling me that too when the Final Fantasy 16 trailer came out. I remember you discussing that.
Yeah. Well, I think it's um, I think it's a big problem that Square Enix continuously doesn't try to address, and they just keep sidestepping the issue by making new battle systems that aren't worth a damn, instead of actually trying to address what the problem is. And the Final Fantasy VII remake, that's the closest that they've come to actually making a decent action-based combat system. But even with that, they ruined that by not putting in certain things that should have been in the combat system, such as invincibility frames, um, and just more appropriate AI.
Uh,
Um, it's really sad, man. Game developers don't know what the hell they're doing. But is there anything you wanted to add to this point?
no, it looks like you're hitting it all on the head.
Yeah. Moving on, we have number 14. The Final Fantasy brand eats other games alive. So the JRPG genre is chock full of some of the greatest games of all time, such as Chrono Trigger, the Persona series, Earthbound. There's a few more in there, like the Tales games, Disgaea, you know.
Right, I've
Um,
heard.
but unfortunately, those other series they don't get the recognition they deserve, since most gamers tend to think of only one franchise when the JRPG genre is mentioned. It doesn't take a genius to guess which one. A series with 15 main titles, now 16, without counting the insane number of spin-off titles it has generated, is bound to get its fair share of recognition. Final Fantasy's looming shadow has caused other better franchises to flounder, and yeah, that's definitely true. Um, as great as a game such as Persona is, like Persona 5, for example, which is better than any RPG that Square Enix has released since 2006, really. Um, yeah, it's not it doesn't have the level of popularity that the recent entries in the Final Fantasy series has, and it absolutely deserves that. But I think one of the reasons these other franchises don't have Final Fantasies um, the level of success that Final Fantasy has had is because of production quality. Um,
Mm,
Square Enix, that's one thing that Square Enix does is that they uh, they are very adamant about pushing technology forward, and they want their games to be mainstream. And one of the biggest ways to do that is to invest a lot of money into graphics and production, you know, production quality, production, effects, big, colorful effects on the screen, and smooth controls and all of that, and more of a fast pace when it comes to the gameplay. And that's something that they've been pushing and continue to push with each game that they release. Not just in Final Fantasy, but in like Kingdom Hearts is another good example. And so that's a big that's a big part of the secret behind Final Fantasy, why it's as successful as it is, and these other JRPG franchises just aren't. Um, but as we all know, or as we all should know, just because a game looks good doesn't mean that it's a good game. So
that's true for sure.
yeah, so Final Fantasy 13 at the time when it first came out back in 2010 here in the states, that game had some of the best production quality I've ever seen. But the game was still a fucking 20+ hour uh, hallway simulator where you just walked in a straight line, and just the only kind of interaction you could have with anything in the game is just a bunch of random encounters. And then even when you got to the open world part, there were no towns, there were no NPCs to interact with. Getting a chocobo was annoying as hell and very time consuming. And the open world was empty as a motherfucker, and it was boring. So, and you compare that to something like um, like the Tales games or whatever that actually, even though their production quality isn't as high, they offer more gameplay, you know, more value than some of the recent entries in the Final Fantasy series. But
Right.
it's just it's a part of what's wrong with Square Enix as a company and the industry
Yeah.
as a whole.
Yeah, this was actually a real good point too, because I never really thought about it like that too. Uh, just I know definitely for sure when people think of JRPGs, like Final Fantasy, like that's a staple right there. That's the main thing that comes to first to everyone's mind. And yeah, I was definitely guilty of that a few years ago as well. Whenever that came up, it was always Final Fantasy, Final Fantasy, Final Fantasy. That's what everyone's talking about. and it definitely made me not become familiar with those other type of games as well. It kind of made me ignore those type of games and like only focus on Final Fantasy. But luckily that's changed. But yeah, that's definitely a good point right here.
Yeah, there's a lot of other JRPG franchises that have basically outgrown the quality of the Final Fantasy series as it stands now,
Mm.
and they just don't get the recognition that they deserve because Final Fantasy is just the bigger franchise, um, regardless of quality. So next up, the overload of DLC and microtransactions have corrupted the genre, and yeah, this is a big problem as well. Final Fantasy is, or in this case, was known for having epic 50 plus hour stories that spanned various worlds, timelines, and eras. The sheer scope of each game that had been released was mind blowing every single time, but right now, this tradition seems to be over. Instead of providing us with all the content from the get go, Square Enix has adopted the model most gaming publishers are notorious for right now, and have started including a ton of DLC and microtransactions in their products in order to rake in more cash. In fact, the main story of Final Fantasy 15 can be completed in just around 25 hours, which is just plain sacrilege when it comes to a Final Fantasy title. Actually, Final Fantasy 15, I played through Final Fantasy 15 twice. Um, Once on, actually, I think I did it 3 times. Once, just starting a new game, and then 2 more times with New Game Plus. And if you just ignore the side missions in Final Fantasy 15, you can actually complete it in, I believe, less than 20 hours. Um, Especially if you're doing a New Game Plus run. Now that's abysmal for a runtime for a Final Fantasy game. Final Fantasy games should be minimum around 40 hours long. And then they also did the same thing for the Final Fantasy VII remake, which can be completed in around 30 hours, a little over 30 hours. Um, and of course, most of that time was padded with a bunch of boring ass side missions. So,
Right.
um, yeah, when it
I
comes,
know with Final Fantasy 15 too, they had those the character DLCs too, but I don't know how long those were.
they were
They were just like straight linear too.
they were around maybe 2 hours in length each.
Okay.
Yeah, I played all of the DLC for Final Fantasy 15, um, and yeah, they were around yeah, a good 2 hours each. This is one of them. This is episode Prompto. So yeah, when it comes to microtransactions and DLC and shit, Square Enix is, once again, they're not above any other publisher. They're just as bad as other companies such as Electronic Arts, EA, Ubisoft, Activision. They will press DLC, and then they'll even lie and say, "Oh, it's not DLC. It's just something that we weren't able to get into the game, but it's not DLC." It's like, yes, it's DLC, motherfucker. We know what DLC is, and yeah, they'll do anything to get you to pay extra. That's why the Marvel the Avengers game or whatever that they published, that entire game was nothing but a cheap attempt to try and make more money off of microtransactions and cosmetics. And so Square Enix isn't above typical standard industry practices. And this is part of the reason why the Final Fantasy series has declined in quality, is because you know they just don't care, and they want to make as much money as possible, and will sacrifice the quality of their own flagship series in order to do it. So um, it's a big problem, and this even means releasing games that aren't even finished, like Final Fantasy 15, and basically. you know, downscaling the length of the game to where it no longer fits with you know, the series tradition. So um, yeah, I'm not sure if you have anything to comment on for that.
Nothing not more for me.
Moving on, uncovering hidden secrets, some of which are crucial to the game, is almost impossible without a walkthrough. And so this is really a big part of a big point regarding the older games in the series.
Uh,
Because the thing I love about this article is that it doesn't just criticize the modern Final Fantasy games, but it also criticizes the older ones as well. And this is a scene from the original Final Fantasy VII. Um,
oh, really? That's a original Final Fantasy VII?
yeah, there's Cloud right here, and then there's Zack right here.
Okay.
Yeah. So there are a number of hidden secrets in most of the Final Fantasy games that are a great find, either providing more context to the events of the story or giving you a cool item or spell that can be quite invaluable. The problem is that these games have way too many vague secrets like this, and finding all of them in order to feel satisfied with your overall gaming experience can be quite a chore. Don't get me wrong, figuring out secrets in games can be quite a rewarding experience, but it's the sheer volume of these secrets that can wear down the player over time. This is doubly true when they include crucial plot information like in Final Fantasy VII. Now, Final Fantasy VII, the original, didn't really have too many of these hidden secrets, but it did have, you know, a few. Um,
Uh,
Final Fantasy VI had, well, really Final Fantasy 1 through 7 had this issue where um, you know, you really didn't the game didn't point out on the map like where you were supposed to go and shit, so sometimes you would like get confused as to, you know, if you put the game down for a week or longer, and then you would come back and be like, fuck, what am I supposed to do? Where am I supposed to go? And so you would end up like running into things like randomly by mistake because you're trying to figure out what your next objective is and where that objective is located. Now, the hidden secrets, you know, some of these things, you know, you wouldn't uncover them thanks to the lack of an objective list like you have in really any modern video game now. Um, you know, telling you, you know, this is where you're supposed to go or whatever, or pointing you into the right direction. Now, Final Fantasy has gotten better with that, but yeah, it's definitely a problem in the older games. Um,
okay.
yeah, I don't think you played any of the like the older games. I think
Yeah. Yeah, I haven't played any of the older ones at all.
uh, yeah, so you wouldn't know what I'm talking about then. But yeah, that was definitely a problem in the older games. Number 11, grinding can be necessary and is never fun. Uh,
Yeah, gosh.
I mean that the grinding it depends. It really does depend. I think it depends on the battle system. I think the uh, the photo here is with Final Fantasy 12. I mean, it's debatable. Final Fantasy 12 moved not when you first start the game, but like once you get into it and you've been playing for several hours, you know, and the combat system picks up. It actually has a
Mhm.
much faster pace than the older Final Fantasy games, and that's part of what makes it fun. But Final Fantasy 12 did have a ridiculous amount of grinding that you had to do in order to get through the game successfully. Um, and so it says, remember the super bosses we were discussing earlier? Well, if you really want to take them on, then prepare to slay thousands of enemies because you'll need a boatload of grinding in order to reach the highest level, which for the most part is level 99, possible in order to even stand a chance of winning against them. So,
And I take back what I said earlier. It wasn't 11 I played. It was 12 because I remember from the picture. Yeah, it was this one.
oh yeah, you did play Final Fantasy 12. I remember you talking to me about that. But yeah, the grinding is a big part of the gameplay in these games, and it can get annoying being forced to just fight mob after mob after mob after mob of enemies just to level up to be strong enough to fight whatever overpowered piece of shit boss that you have to play in order to progress in the story. Um,
Yeah,
that kind of game design is archaic. It's old and it's not fun, it's not engaging, and it's just annoying. And I think it's part of
yeah,
the reason why the turn-based genre really has died out. With very, very few games coming out with that utilize that type of combat. You know, Square Enix, I think they also recognize this, and that's why you know, they've gone more into an action-oriented direction with these games, and it doesn't look like they're turning back. Um,
yeah. I do appreciate that because I can't stand the grind. It really just takes too much time getting into that real action. It just slows the story down as well for me.
right. Um, so in a way, this is one of the only things that they've kind of tried to address with the newer games compared to the older ones, which definitely will not hesitate to waste your time. As far as the whole being forced to grind and all that. But it does point out to a bigger problem that the series is further you know, getting away from its original identity. So yeah, number 10 we have people tend to ignore just how empty the world map is. Now, this can so this is the original Final Fantasy VII. This is Cloud right here. Um,
Huh?
now, when it comes to the open world right here, um,
Huh?
a lot of the older Final Fantasy games were like this, particularly most notably Final Fantasy 7, 8, and 9 were like this. You have the open world map right here, and these little dots are the locations or whatever that you can go to.
Huh?
But none of them are marked, and so you kind of have to memorize. You have to memorize, you know, what each little dot is, and you know, there's varying ways to traverse the world map. Um, but outside of random encounters, there's not really anything to do on the actual world map itself. So yeah, this is I get yeah, that is a flaw with the older games. Um, assessing the open world in any Final Fantasy game for the first time can be a great experience. However, don't expect it to last for too long. The world is just an excuse for you to move from one location to another, while it provides the illusion that you're actually traveling through vast continents and whatnot. The truth is that these world map segments are absolutely bare segments of land, differentiated through different terrain colors and nothing else. There's also the frequent random encounters one has to deal with while roaming this boring landscape, which, as we know, is a ton of fun. So, you know, a little injection of sarcasm right there. Um, but yeah, the random encounters were fucking annoying in the older Final
Yeah.
Fantasy games because you would just run around and just out of nowhere, battle music just pops up, you know, and an enemy pops out the game's ass, and you know you'll kill that enemy, move on. 10 seconds later, and it's like, dude, I just want to make progress. Like,
Yeah. 10, yeah, because the oldest Final Fantasy I played was 10, and it had a lot of that shit, and it was real annoying.
yeah. Um, And the thing about it is like even the remasters of like say Final Fantasy 7 and 8, they have cheats or whatever in the newer versions of the games where you can turn the random encounters off. So you know Square Enix is aware that that kind of gameplay is fucking outdated, and it's just it's not fun. So
Yeah.
they've done their best to try and fix it while retaining the same experience. And now with the newer Final Fantasy games, they'll just put the enemies on screen so you can actually see where they are. Um, and so you can decide whether you want to run around them or engage them or whatever. Um, and
A lot better.
they started doing that with well, really they started doing it with Final Fantasy 12, and just have continued that with each game. And yeah, that is a major improvement. So I'll give it that. But yeah, that's definitely a nitpick, or not nitpick, but it's a legit criticism of the older games. Number nine. Most characters have cliched anime personalities,
Mm.
which is yeah, it's true. it's it's true. It's not a lie. Um, for a game heavily reliant on its story and characters, the treatment of the latter has been fairly questionable in the Final Fantasy series. While there has been undeniably and been a number of great characters that have provided memorable moments throughout the course of the franchise, it's only a minority who've left such a mark on fans. The majority of Final Fantasy characters range from generic, boring, dumb, useless, and sometimes downright irritating at times. At least the previous games allowed you to choose your characters so that you could, ignore the ones you didn't like. But in the latest Final Fantasy, you have no such option, meaning that you have no other choice other than to bear with Prompto for a major chunk of the game. Um, Prompto didn't really annoy me as much as some of the other characters from the older games. I think the game like Final Fantasy 12, for example. That cast is pretty boring. There's nothing interesting really about anyone in that game except for Balthier. He's the only one that really stood out. Everyone else is pretty much a blank slate. The the cast of Final Fantasy 13 and 10, however, those games have easily the worst cast out of any of the Final Fantasy games. The characters are just dumb, they're stupid, they're annoying. There's maybe only like one or two characters that are actually cool, and then everyone else is just shit. For Final Fantasy X, the cool character was Auron, and everyone else was just you know wanted to put a bullet to their head, basically. Um, And then in Final Fantasy 13, the cool character really was Saz. Fang was okay as well. The rest, everyone else was just trash. Lightning was trash. Snow was trash. Hope was trash. Vanille was trash. So, um, yeah, these games they've gotten worse really over time when it comes to like story and characters. The only two games in the series that really stand out as far as the characters go really is Final Fantasy 6 and 7. The rest of them are just who cares, you know? Um, yeah, Final Fantasy 4 had a decent cast as well, but no, Final Fantasy 6 and 7 are the ones that are mentioned the most when it comes to like story and characters.
Yeah, I was just about to bring that up. Whenever people are talking about Final Fantasy, it's mostly from I haven't played it. Everyone's always talking about the characters from Seven. Outside of that, I rarely see anybody talking about anybody anybody else in that whole entire franchise.
The
Never see any like that.
diehard fans will talk about the games like Final Fantasy 8 and Final Fantasy 9. The characters of Final Fantasy 8 are dumb as shit. They're annoying as shit. Um, and the characters in Final Fantasy 9, well, I really don't want to speak too much on Final Fantasy 9 because I haven't really played that one extensively. Um, but from what I saw, they were just typical anime stereotypes. So, yep, that's another valid criticism. And number eight, Final Fantasy 15 has cemented the fact that turn-based battles are a thing of the past. So it goes on to say Persona 5 might be a great game that utilizes the turn-based battle system to its full extent, but there's no questioning that this particular battle system has become absolutely archaic in the modern age of video games, which is what I was saying earlier. Real-time battle systems are what's in right now, and Final Fantasy 15 cast aside the series tradition like they were nothing at all. Final Fantasy 15's combat is decidedly less strategic than its series roots, and sadly, it's clear that this is the final nail in the classic turn-based battle systems JRPG fans know and love. Of course, there will still be outliers, but whenever Final Fantasy goes, wherever it goes, the genre follows. It's devastating for fans of the once great Japanese role-playing game genre. So, what are your thoughts on that?
Uh, yeah, it's definitely true because I'm definitely not a fan of the turn-based combat system anymore. It's definitely outdated. I did play Persona 5 for a bit too as well, and I have to admit that I wasn't too much of a fan of that. And so what the Square Enix is doing right now, kind of like with Final Fantasy 15, with the combat, yeah, it was definitely, I'd say, more of a breath of fresh air because like after playing 13 too, seeing them go in that direction, it was a lot better for me, and I actually felt a lot more engaged with the combat as well too. So yeah, I definitely feel that turn based is definitely way too outdated in my opinion.
For me, it depends on how it's executed. Um,
Mm,
like turn-based is all about how the options that the game developers give the player. If you give me enough options and it doesn't take a long ass time to to progress as far as the progression
uh,
goes, then the turn-based and it has depth to it, then the turn-based combat system is something I can get down with. But even then, I do recognize that most modern players don't want to play anything where the characters are just standing in place and the little bar fills up and you press X to attack and then they do one swipe and then go back to their little spot. Um, most players don't want to play anything like that. Um, that turn based has become very niche, and I think it was always niche, but it's just become more niche and practically non-existent at this point. Um, now, like I said, if they I've never been against the idea of Final Fantasy going more action oriented, but if you're going to do it, do it right. And there were holes with the combat system in Final Fantasy 15. There were some really big holes with the combat system in the Final Fantasy 7 remake, and so until I see like a combat system that's just good all the way around, is great all the way around, I don't think it's really a good direction for the series in general to just completely abandon the turn-based routes. So that's really my stance on it.
mm. It definitely looks like with Final Fantasy 16 too, you're gonna be disappointed as well.
Well, I don't know exactly what they're going to do with the combat system for that. All we know at this point is that it's going to be uh, more action oriented. Um, I do know one thing. I'm not, buying Final Fantasy 16 day one if I buy it at all. Number seven, the stories were honestly not that great. Yeah. Yeah. Each Final Fantasy game is a standalone story, which is quite great since it allows developers to craft their own lore, world, and characters from scratch and create a standalone experience of sorts. Which is why the sequels have always been met with disdain from a sizable chunk of the fan base. However, this certainly doesn't mean that the stories are absolute epics. In fact, most of these tales have a ton of plot holes and that players tend to ignore in order to focus on the big picture. Um, One of the reasons for this willful ignorance might be that, and that goes into the next point. But before we get into it, um, Yeah, the stories in a lot of these games are really stupid. Um, they basically reuse the same plot over and over again, just in different ways. And so whenever I hear someone try and defend the Final Fantasy series, saying that every game is different and they give you something new each time, it's like not really. They just give you the same formula, the same concept done in a different way. Um, and it's not any better than any actual anime that you can just sit down and watch. Um, the stories have been trash really since the original Final Fantasy VII. Even the story in the original Final Fantasy VII isn't that great when you actually look at it for what it is. The thing that made Final Fantasy VII great were the characters. You know, the characters are what make that game special. The actual story itself is kind of stupid. Like just being honest. I think the game that has the best story in the entire series is Final Fantasy VI. Um, but again, Final Fantasy VI is like it's a very old game, so most people are not going to look at that game. They're going to look at the ones that came after it, and the ones that come after it are just trash when it comes to storytelling. Not sure what your opinion is on this.
Oh yeah, you're actually right. All the Final Fantasies I played, it was just some mediocre storytelling. It wasn't nothing special. The characters were nothing special either. Some of them were just pretty cliche as well. Didn't really stand out that much. And I didn't see it at first when you used to tell me how much you hated Final Fantasy X. Now that I kind of look back on it, yeah, some of the characters were so like, man, they were just way too fucking like it's like too stupid and goofy. Like the first character that comes to mind is Walker. Just the whole character design of him. I was like, oh man, he just looks fucking ridiculous. Now that I go back and look at it, but yeah, I definitely feel the same way.
But the thing is, like with a game like Final Fantasy X, because for a lot of people, Final Fantasy X that was like their first game, their first entry into the series. Um, they're gonna look at back on a game like that with nostalgia. They're gonna have the little nostalgia glasses on. Oh, I remember this and I remember that. They're not going to look at it objectively and see what the actual flaws of that game are. They're just and if they're presented with an argument, they're going to fanboy and try and defend the game because they feel like that's their childhood being attacked. And it's like, I don't look at things like that. I look at things objectively. Um,
Mm.
and anyone who does that is always going to be met with some form of contempt. So that's part of what I based my channel on. Be
Right.
truthful, be honest, and don't give a shit what anyone says. If
Mm.
something is shit, then something is shit. That's I'm sorry for telling it how it is, except I'm not. um, Speaking of nostalgia,
Well, yeah.
nostalgia is a powerful drug.
What Final Fantasy is this one in the picture?
That is Final Fantasy IX.
Okay.
Yeah. Gamers and people in general tend to remember things more fondly when it has affected their childhood in some way, which is part of what I was just saying. And there's absolutely no doubt that Final Fantasy has been an integral part of many gamers' childhoods. However, this certainly doesn't mean that this series is the greatest gaming franchise of all time. Far from it. Rather, it's the instance of gamers to look at the end product through nostalgia goggles and selectively picking parts of the game that affected them, ignoring all the flaws in the process. And Final Fantasy indeed has a ton of flaws. You just don't hear many people gripe about it that much. And so this goes back to what I was saying that um, this is a problem with gamers in general, but specifically when it comes to Square Enix fans, and even more specifically when it comes to Final Fantasy fans, and why I consider Final Fantasy fans to be some of the dumbest and really any fan base that exists in the gaming industry is because they don't look at these games objectively. They look at them through a nostalgia lens, and they will basically try and deflect and not really want to recognize exactly what's wrong with these games and the fact that they are not perfect and they do have legit issues, but they don't want to admit that, and that's a big problem. Um, when we have games that are like that have fan bases that are that loyal, um, the series or the IP really suffers because once the company that the companies that make these games, once they see that, oh, we got the fans right where we want them, all of a sudden that's when they stop innovating. That's when they start trying to copy other things that are already popular, and as a means to make easy money with less effort. And that's basically what's happened to the Final Fantasy series. Um, and it shouldn't be like that. The fans should be vocal about what doesn't work in these games, so Square Enix can be forced to actually improve on the formula um, instead of being lazy and just trying to force uh, tropes from other games into the series. Um, but alas, that's part of what you get when you inject something too much with with nostalgia.
Right.
What do you think about this issue?
Oh yeah, I have to say that I agree with you as well. When you get people and they have those nostalgia glasses on, like you said, how it affected their childhood, they're not gonna go back and try and see what was wrong with it. And when someone brings up an argument, they instantly get real offended and real sensitive about it, and they're gonna like even if they don't make any sense, they'll come at you wrong with like any type of petty little argument, just some pretty bad jokes, just I don't know, make fun of you or just completely disregard everything you said, even if you're making trying to make sense to them. So it's definitely true, and you can see it in any industry, and whether you're like music industry or what else, it's definitely a big issue. And like you said, when this happens, and people are like this, companies they won't really try to see what wrong they're doing if people are loving it so far, and they'll just keep doing whatever it's selling right and won't even try to improve much. So yeah, I definitely agree with you on that.
Yeah, they'll take advantage of the fan base. They'll take advantage of the ignorance. And
Mm.
because at the end of the day, these companies are a business, and businesses exist to make money. So if they can keep the fans stupid and make more money versus trying to improve their product, and potentially make less money, it's like, which option do you go with as a business? You're going to go with the first option. So that's just the way it goes. Um, Next point, number 5. The Final Fantasy 13 trilogy wasn't the best idea. Yeah,
That's for sure.
that fucking shit's an understatement. That's an understatement if I ever did read one. We've already talked about how many sequels have broken the sacred rule of the Final Fantasy franchise. Final Fantasy X-2 was completely unnecessary. Um, Second part of a game that already had a pretty definitive ending. However, perhaps the strongest argument against these sequels would be the existence of the Final Fantasy XIII trilogy. Final Fantasy XIII was one of the lowest scoring games of any Final Fantasy game ever, receiving a mediocre reception from fans and critics alike, which begs the question as to why Square Enix decided to develop 2 more games that would continue Lightning's uninteresting story. Uninteresting and ridiculous story. The end
Yeah,
was
I'm honestly surprised they pulled this too. After like I know after Final Fantasy X they had Final Fantasy 11 based off of Yuna. Um, I forgot those other two names too, and I think it fought pretty hard. Oh, I'm surprised they even made like I guess a sequel to it, especially with like those two uninteresting characters, that girl, and that other young boy that was her Lightning's companion. So that was a big surprise to me. They made an entire game to off those two. Lightning Returns was pretty fucking boring as well. It wasn't interesting at all to me.
Oh, you must be talking about you must be talking about these two, right?
Yeah, yeah, yep.
Oh well, this I forget this character's name, but he wasn't in Final Fantasy 13 at all. He's
Oh, he wasn't.
no, he was some random character that they made for the sequel. And
Oh damn.
Sarah here is Lightning's younger sister, and
Okay.
she wasn't interesting in the first game, so I don't know why they made her the protagonist for the sequel, despite the fact that
Yeah.
Lightning's on the main cover. So it's like, well,
Yeah. I don't know why they made that decision.
I don't know. But uh, continuing on, the end result was an underwhelming trilogy that truly propagated the downward spiral of pretty much the JRPG genre as a whole. So yeah, Final Fantasy 13. Now, Final Fantasy 13, I hate Final Fantasy 13, but Final Fantasy 13, if you look at it for what it is, if you look at it closely, a lot of what Final Fantasy 13 is and what it tries to do basically comes from Final Fantasy X. And this is why I don't understand why people like Final Fantasy X, because everything that's wrong with Final Fantasy 13 basically it borrowed its ideas from Final Fantasy X. Final Fantasy X was a linear Final Fantasy game that had very little opportunity for exploration, terrible progression system, annoying, uninteresting characters, a story that was just stupid and ridiculous, and a length that was overlong, and an annoying, emphasis on grind heavy gameplay. And Final Fantasy 13 had all of these issues and then some. Basically, they were trying to pull another Final Fantasy X out of the hat, and people weren't having it. Um, Now, the thing is, like Final Fantasy X also was like the first major game released on the PlayStation 2. It was the first time that Final Fantasy was seen in a more uh, I guess a more realistic fashion compared to the older games. So when Final Fantasy 13 came out, it's not like it was anything that you know people hadn't already seen before. So um, that's part of the reason why I don't think it worked a second time. The fact that they made two more games after the first one just doesn't make any sense to me. I don't know why they bothered wasting their time doing that, but yeah, people were not happy at all, myself included. Um, yeah, they royally fucked this whole series up. And Final Fantasy 13 was one of the main reasons why. Moving on, its terrible story structure has inspired many other JRPGs. Now, Mike, you haven't played too many other JRPGs, have you?
No, I haven't.
Hmm, yeah. Yeah. It's the. I mean, if you look at other JRPGs, clearly a lot of their ideas come from Final Fantasy, and so they'll borrow all the wrong things from Final Fantasy as well, and actually do it far worse than what Final Fantasy had already fucked up on. Um, and so we get more mediocre games because of Square Enix and their nonsense. And this is why the JRPG genre is nowhere near as popular as it once was. And so it goes on to read the plot of Most Final Fantasy games aren't terribly innovative or fresh. However, given the medium Square Enix is using, video games, Final Fantasy has always stuck to a formula that's known to work. What has inevitably happened is that most JRPGs follow a similar template, trying to ape Square's massively popular series. The result is a myriad of games that have all the same cliches and dull plot twists. Anyone who's played any of the major Final Fantasy games will already have a big idea of how the storyline will play out in these JRPGs. Guess what? Most of the games have the same redundant issues. Now, this isn't just an issue with Final Fantasy and JRPGs, but it's actually an issue with video games as a whole, regardless of the genre. If something popular comes out, you'll usually see like a bunch of mimics and copies of the same game. When one of the most notable examples would be like the Dark Souls games, the Souls-like genre, everywhere.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, that almost every developer you could fucking think of has tried to make their own goddamn version of a Dark Souls game, and you know the lack of creativity and in the carrying over what the issues are with those games into other games. It's not something that I've ever supported. It's not just those. There's plenty of other examples, but yeah, it's not just an issue with Final Fantasy and JRPGs. What do you think about this?
Oh yeah, it's definitely true. I mean, we see it with a lot of stuff. Not even just video games, but movies too. Like you have a successful film, and say you have like those successful shitty horror films. Kind of like oh shit, what's it called? Paranormal Activity. You'll probably get like a few other copies like that too, because people think, hey, since that's successful, hey, we're gonna pull that and try to pull the same income in it too. And another good example is like kind of like those weird ass doll movies like Annabelle. You have those other copies of it too. I know there's a girl from the Walking Dead movie. She was in that one movie, Braum, based on that other doll character. Oh yeah, so it's definitely true. Stuff like that definitely brings about another shitty carbon copies of it, trying to achieve the same success that it's achieved. So yeah, no doubt about it.
Yeah, when you get something that's popular, people try, the industry tries to copy that, and that same formula to make more, to make easy money, and yeah, it never really turns out well. And your example of Paranormal Activity, really that started with the Blair Witch Project.
Yeah, I remember that movie.
Yeah, I fucking hate that movie. Yeah, a lot of people love that movie. I don't know why. Um, Number three, super bosses are wrongly considered a Final Fantasy staple. And
What
so
was that? What did that title say again?
wrongly
Oh,
considered
okay.
a Final Fantasy staple. Yeah. So this is um this is Final Fantasy VII, the original. This is Ruby Weapon. One of the most overpowered broken ass bosses ever. In the history of fucking video games, this thing is so fucking overpowered it can wipe out a whole party member in like one attack at full health, like leveled up, and it
Yeah, that's
can
annoying.
permanently knock a party member out of the battle. So, um, yeah, super bosses have
Yeah,
become a mainstay of most JRPG games, but there's no doubt that most iconic of all of them are almost exclusive to the Final Fantasy series. Bosses like Ruby Weapon and Omega Weapon, Ozma, Penance, I believe those are like from Final Fantasy 12, and many others are the names that most gamers remember, either begrudgingly or otherwise. Frankly, the fact that these super bosses even exist to begin with um, is a pain in itself. In order to defeat these behemoths, one needs to waste copious amounts of time leveling up it to increase your stats strategically in order to get them high enough to think about, challenging these bosses. The actual final boss of these titles becomes a cakewalk once you defeat these super bosses, which kind of defeats the whole point of the game. Now, Square Enix has done super bosses in some of their other games too, like Kingdom Hearts. Kingdom Hearts games have super bosses as well, and they also have the same flaw. Whereas the super bosses are actually more powerful than the final boss of the game, which, like the article states, defeats the whole purpose, the whole point. Um, and so you have these super challenges, and other games have this too, such as like Persona 5 has the Reaper boss or whatever that you encounter in Mementos, and that thing is harder than any of the bosses that are in the game. So I think this is something that's really a genre issue, which is the JRPG. No one wants to play, a boss that's practically impossible to beat, that you need to, you know, use some actual brain power in order to come up with a strategy that actually works. Not too many people want to do something like that. So, what are
I hate
you?
it with passion.
Yeah, what are your thoughts on this, Mike?
Yeah, I hate it with a passion. Definitely brings me back to Final Fantasy X. There were a few super bosses just like that. I think one of them was I think when we were facing Seymour, one that little monster you used to summon, he had this one attack that could just take out a party member in one shot. Then there was another moment close to the end of the game where you had to fight shoot, I think her name was Lady Unileska, and she could wipe out the whole party with just one attack. It was just so bullshit. It was just so frustrating to play. I almost wanted to quit honestly, my playthrough, but luckily I ended up beating her. But it was just awesome dumb luck, honestly. I honestly hate super bosses.
Yeah, it's really lazy game design to overpower a boss so much to where um, they can wipe out, you know, um, the player's characters or whatever just within the span of a few attacks. It's that's really not good game design in my opinion, and that's something I've always been against. And even like with the re-release of Final Fantasy VII, the original on PS4, they made it so one of the cheats they give you is invincibility, so you can just you know have a fighting chance against a boss like Ruby Weapon or Emerald Weapon without having to suffer through um, the actual boss, um, the actual fight playing legit. So it's not like Square Enix isn't aware of some of the downsides from their earlier games. So we're down to the final two. Square Enix can't handle such a massive franchise. And so Square Enix has made a number of dubious decisions that have made some hardcore fans worry about the future of the franchise. We've already talked about the constant shoving of DLC and microtransactions down our throats, but the shady business practices that Square Enix has showcased does cast doubt over how they handle their IPs, from forcing developers to include elements that don't fit into their vision, to utilizing other shady pre-order practices to get more money. It seems that Square Enix is simply trying to see how far they can lower the bar before people actually decide to raise their voice against the publisher's questionable practices. And the sad part is we're still not at that point where people are actually, enough people are actually speaking up to where Square Enix, would be forced to actually go back and make something that's actually, worth people's time.
Right.
What are your, what do you got to say on this point?
I mean, yeah, it's definitely true. Square Enix. I'm not sure what the fuck's going on with them. After you were explaining to me like a few of the titles that I haven't really heard about until you told me about, like that Final Fantasy battle game. What was the name you're telling me about? Remember the name of it?
The what was it?
City of Final Fantasy, the City.
Yeah, the
Is
city
that
at
the right? Is that
MT.
the title?
Yeah.
Yeah, hearing like their decisions regarding that game. Just even shoot, even the fucking Avengers game they have released now. It's like, what the fuck is Square Enix doing? It's like they make just the worst decision just to screw over the consumer, and it's just pretty awful. And it really goes to show that they just don't really give a fuck about the fan base at all. They just want to just see how much money they can really get out of them, and how far they can really how low they can really go, and keep pushing everyone's buttons. So yeah.
I mean, that's why when the Final Fantasy VII remake, when that was praised last year, I mean, I understand it's not necessarily a bad game, but it's not really a good game either, and that's why I said it was like mediocre in my retrospective because um, there are issues, some serious issues with it, but instead of actually enough fans coming out and saying, oh yeah, y'all could have done a better job with this. Here's what you fucked up on. Instead, oh, you're not allowed to criticize, Final Fantasy. You're not allowed to do this. It makes no difference to compare this and this together, and just deflection after deflection after deflection. Um, it's part of the reason why Square Enix. I don't believe they'll ever truly improve at this point as a company.
Oh yeah, they're long gone. And the
Yeah,
way they handled Kingdom Hearts 3 too. That was sad.
yeah. Well, that's another video altogether. Number one, its mainstream success has paralyzed the genre completely. So Final Fantasy has always been at the forefront of innovation in the industry. The series pushed for voice acting on the PS2 and displaced media jumping from the Super Nintendo to the PlayStation. The series used to know no bounds. Today, however, the series is staunchly locked in a work of wacky hair and belts galore. Sadly, it seems like dozens of other JRPGs have followed in Final Fantasy's footsteps, hoping to ride its aesthetic coattails and climb their way into the hearts of the mainstream audience. If Final Fantasy would take more risk, then perhaps we would see other games doing the same. And so, you know, every JRPG basically, follows behind Final Fantasy because Final Fantasy is like the leading IP for this particular genre. But with that comes all of the issues that's wrong with Final Fantasy as a series that becomes an issue with games trying to mimic its success and everything. Um, and once again, it goes back to that whole point that Square Enix really doesn't care about quality, the quality of this series, and they only care about money. At the end of the day, what do you think about this, Mike?
Yeah, it's definitely true. And I think with Final Fantasy being at the top, sure, it's definitely no doubt that people are definitely gonna try and copy what Square Enix has done, or with all the Final Fantasy world. I mean, it makes perfect sense. Of course, they want to see that same success with their own, and they'll take a lot of elements from that, even if it's a lot of wrong things as well. Because hey, it's what's popular, it's what's selling, and they see the success it's made. So why not? It makes perfect sense, and you definitely want to get that attention, because if you're really not getting that attention and that success, it goes back to the other videos we were talking about, how studios were going out because nobody really cared about the games. It had such a niche audience, so it's no surprise they're going for that mainstream audience, and want that same success so they can really keep their stuff alive. So yeah, I definitely see how it is like that. So yeah, that's my thoughts on it.
I was wondering if there was anything else that you wanted to add before I close out.
Nope, that was it.
Okay. But yeah, man. Final Fantasy. The quality of the series is way past its prime, and it's not coming back. So, but at least now we know why. So it's not like we don't understand the reason. But hopefully this video enlightens some out there that think they know best, but they don't.